Hello. So I want to talk about. I still, I still have to detail the full story about what happened with my father when I was, with my father. Justice for my father and me, but him. My father was somebody that my mother's parents abused. My mother's family abused when I was young, when my brother was young, before the family really fell apart. It's actually the foundational piece as to why my family fell apart. My father was a mechanic. My father was, I'm sorry, he was a maintenance man. He wasn't, well, he was a mechanic too, but he knew how to fix cars, kind of. I don't know if he was ever paid to be a mechanic, but he was a maintenance man. He was a delivery driver for Airborne Express. My mother's parents didn't respect him. In fact, they actively disrespected him. They talked around him when he was in front of them. They pretended that he wasn't a human. They effectively spoke around him like he was a dog, like he was a pet. Well, like he was a dog, like he was nothing. Like he was nothing to them. Excuse me. They spoke about him, they spoke around him when he was present. He didn't make much of a living, like in terms of his job. He didn't make a lot of money. He didn't have much of an official education. He didn't really know what he wanted to do with his time, like in terms of his education, his work. It's hard for him. He struggled. My mother's parents did not. They treated him very badly, and they were actually the ones who started calling him Carrie way before my family started falling apart, and they would encourage that between my brother and I when we were young. They would do the attaboyisms socially in front of him when my brother and I would call him Carrie instead of. They would never refer to him as my father. They would never refer to him as. They never called him my father. They never said your dad. They never said anything like that about him to us or to my mom or anything like that. It was always Carrie. And they never addressed him directly after a certain point. They didn't address him directly as a person. They didn't. They addressed him by asking my mom questions about what he would say or think, or they would ask her to ask him something while he was standing in front of them. They would pretend like he wasn't present. They would laugh when people called him Carrie. They would laugh in this shitty way when people would call him Carrie. And be, haha, attaboy, attaboy. And then they would take my brother shopping. And only my brother. And they did that, and they would spend hundreds of dollars on him. We were young. I was probably like 5. My brother was probably like 9. And he would come back with a ton of clothes and other stuff. They would spoil him a lot. They did that they did that probably once every month or every 2 months. At its worst, it was once every other week. And my mom joined in on it. She did. She was very influenceable about that. Yeah, so that's what was going on when I was young. My eyes really itch. Uh, my my mom was somebody that didn't respect my father. Neither did my mother's brother. Not at all. He would do the same thing to him. And that whole circumstance was very toxic and insidious. And when we needed a new refrigerator, my mom's parents came by. They drove by, and they offered to buy us one. And then they bought us one. My mom said yes. While my dad was doing maintenance work, and and they did that. Uh, they did that, and effectively didn't allow him to save at all to buy new things for us. And then they would come by and they would, they would have the refrigerator delivered. It happened with refrigerators and appliances. They bought a kitchen table, I believe, at one point. They didn't let my father save for anything. And then when they would come by when it was being delivered, they would make demands of my mother. They would make demands about, or rather, they would make demands on the choices that she should be making in the family and with our lives. They would basically say, yeah, absolutely, and then they would sit there for like 2 or 3 hours right after this expensive thing was delivered, and they would sit down with my mom and tell her how she should be living her life and how the family should be living their lives and how my father needed to do this. Well, how my father, they would basically just talk around my father. They had no respect for him and how they spoke about him. They spoke around him like he wasn't human. They didn't really regard him at all when he wasn't around. And when he was around, they asked my mom to ask him questions. They didn't really talk to him at all, even when he was standing right in front of them. I'm not kidding. Even like down to circumstances where, like dinner was being made or something like that. They would just kind of ask my mom, is this going to be enough for everybody? And, she would say, yeah. And they would say, is everybody going to be happy with this? And she would say, yeah. And then they would basically just ask, and it was when my dad was cooking that they would do that. It was when my dad was cooking dinner when they would come over. They wouldn't talk to him. They wouldn't ask him to make any changes to whatever he was making. They would ask my mom to talk to him. And then my dad would finish making food and they wouldn't eat it. Right in front of him. Even after he changed whatever they wanted, whatever they asked my mom to talk to him about changing, he would make a full dinner for everybody. Oftentimes it was barbecue, which they loved. Bratwurst. My grandparents loved bratwurst. They loved barbecue. They ate it all the time. But when they came by and my dad was cooking it, they would be like, yeah, I'm so hungry. I can't wait to eat. I'm really hungry. And he would finish making food. He would finish barbecuing. And they wouldn't touch it. They refused to eat. And then they would leave about 45 minutes later after everybody else was finished. And they would say, we're going to go to Red Lobster. And sometimes they would take my brother with. They would ask him if he wanted to go with. And then he was a kid. He liked to go out to dinner. He liked to go out to places. He was a kid. They would take him with. They would ask him only. They would take him with. He would go with. And then suddenly he would be gone for probably 4 or 5 days. And he would come back with hundreds of dollars worth of new clothes and shit like that. Well, my dad was just working maintenance. And then, like I said, they would give my mom all of this advice on how to run the family, how to change this, that, and the other. You guys should really do this. Have you thought about this? What about that? They would never do that around my dad. They would never speak to my dad about anything like that. When my parents bought their first house on King Street, my grandfather, my mother's father, it was the first time I ever heard anything racist in front of me. And he said, "Why do you guys insist on living around the Hispanics?" And at that point, we lived in an apartment before that. I don't remember exactly where, but it was within probably 4 or 5 miles from King Street. And effectively, my mother's father was disappointed about the fact that my parents bought a house in the same neighborhood as we lived in before, because we lived around the Hispanics. That's what he said. That's what he said. And then after he said the Hispanics, my mom, I don't know if she heard him. I don't remember exactly. But I asked, I said something. I don't remember. I was really young. And I said something, but I was just confused by the question. I was really young. And he said something along the lines of, I just don't, I just don't get them. Why them? Or he said, why them? Or something like that. At the time, I was too young, but I could sense that something was really wrong with what he was saying. But I was too young. I was too young. It probably took me like a year or two I thought about it after. I kept thinking about it because it was confusing to me. I didn't understand. And then eventually I thought about it for like a year or two. Like, why would he say that? What's wrong? That was actually what was in my head. What's wrong? It took me like a year or two to really realize that what he had said, it wasn't that it took me a year or two to realize what he had said was bad. It took me a year or two to realize what he had said was actually incredibly racist. Severely racist. Because I didn't really know what racism was. I knew that something was really wrong with what he said, though. But I was too young to know what racism was. I was a white kid, and I lived, I was friends with so many different types of people, so many different ethnicities. That was Sheridan, the Sheridan area, particularly back then, and it probably still is the same way. There's so many different ethnicities. It was wonderful. It was. Going to that school district because of that fact was wonderful. And living there because of that fact was wonderful. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around why he said it. It was also the same way at holidays with my dad and them. And they talked around his presence. They didn't respect him at all. And my brother followed their lead. My mother followed their lead. And I was too young to realize that it was abuse that was happening to him. My father. It was, though. And then my mother started drinking. And the foundation of respect in my family for my father was completely destroyed. He had no way. At that point, everything was destroyed. My mother's drinking following that, and then all of the fighting in the family that started, and everything else, because my mother's parents turned my mother and my brother against him over time. And my brother was a very angry young man. For reasons beyond what was going on there, I'm going to stop this and continue recording.